Hi guys, Steve Dempster here, Dempster Guitar Studio, back at you yet again with another video on where stuff comes from. This ongoing series that I've been putting together to help students understand how things are more neatly connected than they probably currently understand, so that they avoid the overwhelm of all the information that's out there to help you play this silly little instrument of ours. And so in this video, we're going to change gears. We're going to move away, sort of, from the major scale and transition ourselves into understanding the thing called the minor scale. I'm not going to confuse the issue with the fact that, in truth, there are actually 3 different versions officially of the minor scale. We're only going to contend with one of them, which is called the natural minor scale. So, just like I said earlier on in the series, if somebody said to you, "Hey, Steve, we're going to do a jam in the key of C," what is it that has to go on in your brain to help you know what you're going to do on the instrument, rather than waiting for somebody to show you what to do? Like, you have the tools already in your mind to help you do that. So one of them was, well, you have to know the scale. In this case, C major scale. You know this already. We've pounded that thing into the earth several times. We'll continue to do that. C, of course, C major, is just one of 12 other major scales that we use in our musical system, and hopefully you've been spending time going through each of those one at a time, figuring out their key signatures, what has to be sharpened or what has to be flattened. The key of C, as you know, doesn't require any sharps or flats because it uses all natural notes. It just makes the process of learning the mechanics a little easier. So just for a quick review, the key of C major uses the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C, and it has the interval structure tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. You should be really sick and tired of hearing that, and that's a good sign. That means it's gone from the front part of your brain, where you have to think about it, to the back part of your brain. I call it the lizard brain, where it's just available now for you. It's information that's become, hopefully I didn't hit the mic there, that's become available to you when you need it. So, in review, C major, I'll just do this on the 2nd string, just sounds like this. And you know it's always a good idea to go backwards. Oh, a little hesitation there, because you need to know it inside and out from all different directions. Whatever notes you start on in that thing, you should ideally be able to get to any other note in the scale without becoming root bound, without starting on C all the time. That's another issue. Okay, so that's the C major scale. And I think if you listen to the structure of it enough, you probably get the impression that it tends to be used in songs that have a sort of light flavor to them, a happy kind of quality, a lightness to them. And you wouldn't be wrong. The majority of people seem to interpret that from any major scale, generally. But in this video, we're going to use the major scale, the C major scale, and flip it around a bit. Flip it around, in fact, so much that it no longer produces that happy kind of quality anymore. Instead, it goes to the dark side. By dark, what I mean is that, again, the majority of people who hear it used in certain contexts, they'll say things like, "Oh, the song sounds sad," or melancholy, or maybe even a bit spooky. Now, if you picked up the information on an A minor scale somewhere, and you just learned it in isolation, you can do that. But to understand that it came from something is way more valuable. I'm going to suggest to you that what you need to be thinking about is that the minor, the natural minor scale, comes from the major scale. So this is a really good example of how knowing one thing really well, in this case the major scale, up and down your neck, on one string. We're still not at the point where we're crossing strings yet, we're getting there. And then simply tweaking that a bit to produce something else, which, if you didn't know that connection, might make you feel like, okay, so what? What's the big deal with an A minor scale, or any minor scale for that matter? That's what we're going to attack today, trying to get a sense of how that scale functions within the context of the C major scale, because they're related. Okay, so we know the C major scale. Let's get at it. We know the C major scale. It's that sound, and it's tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Now, somebody, I'm just kind of imagining this now, somebody probably took that thing and mucked around with it enough to determine that if they started the same scale but on a different note, just to explore it a bit further, that it might produce a sound that was really attractive to their ear. And if that sound was then used a lot because that same person went out into the world and said, hey, you got to use this a lot from the C major scale, then it may have caught on in terms of its popularity. And then somebody probably sat down and said, hey, how did this minor sounding thing, which was, kind of explored and discovered, how did that come about from the major sounding thing? Well, it came about simply because somebody liked the sound of it. Later on, somebody comes along and writes a rule, a musical theory rule about where it came from. But you have to keep in mind that it started with your ear, and it started with what you liked. We can start the C major scale on any one of the notes, and just as a kind of a spoiler alert for future issues, those are modes. But one in particular of all the 7 notes became very attractive to our ears at some point. And it's the sound of the C major scale when you start it on the A note. And then from the A note, you just play all the notes from A to A using the C major scale notes. Are you with me so far? Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to start here on the A. And remember, the reason I'm starting on an A note is simply because somebody liked it enough, the sound that it's about to produce, that it became popular. Only later did it become a rule, and I'm going to talk about that shortly, about how these two things connect, the major scale and the minor scale. And only later did it have its own sort of internal independent structure in terms of chords and arpeggios and all that stuff. That all came later, but the very beginning point was simply that somebody liked it. So here's what it sounds like. Think of this as the C major scale starting on the note A instead of C. And I play exactly the same notes. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. A to A, an octave, just like any other scale, but same notes. Again, played without me yapping about it, here's what it sounds like. And of course, back down. If you think about that, if you're really listening, it has a different overall flavor or vibe to it than the major scale does. It has you might say it has a quality about it that suits an emotion that most people seem to interpret as being a bit sad or a bit melancholy or a bit, again, spooky. Whereas the major scale has a lighter vibe to it, like a bright sunny day. Whereas this sound, same notes, from the same scale, just starting on A instead. That's almost closer to a cloudy day, or a rainy day, if you will. The terms major and minor are, in a sense, historically a bit of a mistranslation from an original, which were large and small. Major, minor, large and small. Large scale, small scale. That sort of idea. It came more from chording, my recollection is, or intervals rather, within the chords. Large intervals, small intervals. However, the terms major and minor have stuck, and I'm saying this because major doesn't mean more important and minor doesn't mean less important. They're all important. It's just a descriptive tool. And eventually, of course, when you hear those terms, you have an expectation in your ear how they're going to sound. If we decide to sit back and go, wow, that was a really cool sound, I love this, it could then become available to you as a tool should you wish to write a sad song. It doesn't have to, just because it's a minor key doesn't mean it's a sad song, but it is a common connection to this. So if you were in a blue mood of some sort, you might be sitting with your guitar and strumming an A minor chord, and if you wanted to play a melody to that, you could use the notes of the scale that I just played. And it all fits sort of magically. It's crazy. One would then say, okay, well, if you can play the C major scale starting on A, and it produces this sadder sound, why does it do that? What is it about starting on the note A and playing through all the natural notes, does it sound sad? It has to do with the intervals and where they're located. Reflect back to your major scale. We're going to be bouncing back and forth quite a bit here. Major scale, as you know, was tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Let's look at this new thing starting on A and look at the interval structure of that, because that's the clue that answers the question, why does it sound so different? It's not random. So, A to B, we have a tone. You know all about that. B to C, semitone, always. C to D, tone. D to E, tone. E to F, as usual, semitone. F to G is a tone, and finally G to A is a tone. So our interval structure is tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone. Major scale, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. It's in there. You got to get it in there. You don't want it to be just ink on paper or a concept you've heard of. You want to own it. It's got to be in here. It's got to be in here. The same with the minor. That's the name of this thing that you've just produced. The minor scale, the natural minor scale in this case, coming directly from a major scale, has the interval formula of tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone. You've got to get that back here into the lizard brain too. You've got to have played it and thought about it so much that it's instinctive. So in some sense, if you were in a situation where somebody wanted you to play in the key of A minor, A natural minor, natural is because all the notes that are in it are completely identical to the notes in the C major scale. The two scales are related. You would have a tool that allows you to play in the key of A minor, provided you either knew the notes, or you knew the intervals, or ideally you know both. And ideally you know those all over the fretboard so you can play wherever you want. It's often not the case for a lot of players. So we work as best we can with what we know, and we produce as best the best kind of music that we can with what we currently know. But you're continually upgrading yourself as you play through this stuff. So let me bring this up again. So you have a C major scale and its related natural minor scale is A minor. Same notes, just starting on A instead of C. It's that simple. That's it. But the difference between the two, people often say, well, if they're the same notes, what's the big deal, Steve? The big deal is a concept, we're not talking about it in this issue so much, but it's a concept called tonality, that the overall emotional flavor of the sound is different in the key of, in a minor key than it is in the major key. So even though you're using the same resources between the two, they produce very different emotional kind of qualities. Sometimes the words aren't good enough to get this stuff across to people, but the term that we use in music to describe that is tonality. Around which tone is the whole thing that you're playing centered? In the key of C major, the tone is C, and everything relates back to the C note. Sounds full and complete, starting and ending on C. That's a simple way of looking at it. If you start on A, you don't get the same feel. It has a different feel, and commonly how that's described is that it's more sad. So we know now that the notes between the two scales are identical. The tonality between them is what makes the difference. We'll talk more on that later in another issue. And what you need to know is that they're related. So you often hear the term A minor is the relative minor to C major. And every major scale that you've gone through in this series, I hope you have anyway, that you've gone through in this series and worked out key signatures and all that stuff, has its own relative minor scale. And the way you figure it out is very simple. You just find the sixth note or the sixth degree of the scale, the major scale, that you're dealing with, and play the same exact notes from that sixth degree, and you've produced the natural minor scale from it. Perfect example of how knowing one thing really well, the major scale, helps you understand where a second concept is coming from, as opposed to just running across it on some YouTube video or some book or DVD that has you playing it, using it, but it just exists as a thing on its own, which it could, but your ability to digest it, in my opinion, is easier when you're drawing from something you already know really well to help you understand something you know less well. So in a sense, you're getting two scales out of one. That's a pretty good deal. That's a 50%, no, it's a 100% return on your knowledge base, right? So, if you think on this a little further, not only are you using the same note structures from the major scale to produce this natural minor scale, the darker sounding scale, if you think on that for a moment, if the notes are the same, are the chords the same? Yeah, nothing's changed. Again though, when you play the chords out in the relative minor, it doesn't sound the same as an entity by itself. It's like looking at two paintings that used exactly the same colors. They're painting exactly the same landscape, let's say, but the artist has sort of, the way they manipulated the colors makes one painting look like it's about to rain, let's say, and the other painting seems very bright. In a sense, that's the kind of comparison that might help visually to get at this idea where the major and the minor scales sound so fundamentally different, even though we're using the same tools to produce them. So if you recall, I forget which issue it is now, the chords of C major would be C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and then back to C. Fine, then that's the sound, and when you play using those chords with C as your tonal center, the song tends to sound relatively happy. Something you'd play on somebody's birthday. Take the same chords, and instead of starting on the C chord, start on the 6th chord of the scale. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor. So now we start with A minor, and then we play through the exact same sequence of chords, and you've got the chords that exist in the key of A minor. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, there are a couple of 3 different forms of this minor scale. This is just the first one. It's important to get this one really well understood, because the other 2 are just little tweaks of it to produce a slightly different sound. And those tweaks do affect the type of chords that come out. But for now, we're just dealing with the natural notes. We're keeping everything clean. You're using exactly the same resources from the major scale to produce the relative minor scale. So here's the chord sequence in the key of A minor. So we have A minor, of course. If you can remember from the original chord sequence in C, the chord that follows A minor is B diminished. It's not a chord you probably play very often. It is a common sound. It's used a lot in music, but I find a lot of guitarists are just not exposed to this. So it would be a good one to get under your fingers. So A minor, B diminished, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, and back to A minor. That's it. It's the same chords, it's just in a new order. Now that doesn't mean we can't do anything interesting with it. If we pick out certain chords from that sequence and only focus our music writing on those chords, you'll produce a sound that's predominantly very sad in nature, in quality. So don't let the fact that they're exactly the same chords in a different order, don't treat that trivially. It's more than just that mechanism. There's a soundscape that goes with it that I think you need to pay attention to help you understand how fundamentally music becomes a connection to your emotions. If something you've listened to in a movie made you cry, I can assure you the composer who put that together at that precise moment in the song was drawing on this kind of knowledge to help induce that emotion in you. Because that dude knew, if I do this sort of thing in a minor type of mode or scale or whatever you want to call it, at that exact time in a movie, it will elicit this kind of emotion. In other words, you're being manipulated. Composers know this stuff. They know how to write music that sounds jubilant and proud. And they're not going to use a minor scale for that. They're going to use major resources, and there's lots of them. Major scale is one of them. If they want, maybe there's a death scene or, you know, a sad passing away scene, they're not going to use the major scale for that. Typically, they're going to draw on other resources. The minor scale would be a good place to go for now. So, yeah, here are the chords in sequence for the A natural minor scale. And you can hear, even in and of itself, as you sequence through, starting on A minor, ending on A minor, the whole thing almost sounds like a song in itself. 3, 4. just by itself. That's not normally how songs are written, but I could do that. And it produces its own painting. The major scale is a happy painting. The minor scale is a sadder painting. That's what you want to think about. Now, the other thing that gets implied by this connection between the two is that, in a sense, if you already know the notes of C major, ideally all over the fretboard, or at least you can calculate your way through up and down each string, you are simultaneously playing the notes of the A natural minor scale at the same time. The difference is that if you're thinking in the key of C, you do tend to bring what you're doing back to C, whether it's a C note or a C chord. In a general sense, you're tending to focus your playing and your phrasing and everything you're doing around that. Whereas if you took the same bunch of notes, but you focused on A instead, that alone makes the listener hear what you're doing sound like it's more sad. So very commonly, for example, I could take these notes. I'm just going to do it from the third string. I'm going to take G, A, B, C, D. I'm just going to take those. Now, if I play a C chord ahead of that and set your brain up for the happy expectation, right? It is what it is. If I play A minor ahead of those notes, you have a different feel. It's almost as if the chord, or the harmony, or the harmonic environment, if you will, is influencing the exact same notes to function differently in that environment in A minor than they do in C major, even though in and of themselves they're exactly the same notes. It does lead to a very important point in music, that a note by itself is just a sound, but a note in the context of a bigger harmony, this sound in terms of this has a function. The same sound in terms of this has a function, completely different effect. This sound in terms of this, completely different effect. So that's an important function that we have to be aware of in music when it comes to this relative minor stuff. Again, it always comes back to the idea that, well, hey Steve, why do you have to do all that if you're using the same structures? Doesn't make any sense. So, but if you can play the C major scale all over the fretboard, the point is you can also be playing the A minor, the A natural minor scale all over the fretboard. It's an important relationship between major and relative minor, something you should be thinking about. So in your PDF, what I did is I laid out, right, if you can see that here, you might not be able to, I laid out the minor scales, or the major scales, sorry, over here, 12 of them, and the 12 minor, relative minor scales over there. If you get this, and you look at it and you say, oh my gosh, it's nothing but, you know, a whole bunch of written out scale stuff. If you just leave it at that level, then everything I've been talking about will become a bit of a useless, moot point. You have to convince yourself, you have to work through these things to convince yourself that you're seeing the effect of the natural minor scale being produced in any one of those major scales. And not just know it at a superficial, hey, I'm aware of it. It's not enough. You've got to get past aware and get to knowing. The only way you're going to know it is you have to do it. And I do make a big point right at the bottom of it. You can see it's all in red there. Well, this one's black and white, but the computer version, PDF, is in red. You've got to sit down and do it. Otherwise, it's just useless information sitting out here in the ether. The beauty is, once you get it for one relationship, like C and A minor, like we just did, you get it for all 12. That's the beauty of it. My gosh, it's so simple. Do you have to think a little more about the other scales because they involve sharps and flats? Sure. Thinking doesn't hurt anybody. You have to exercise this material in your mind so that it becomes easy to use. So make sure you're doing that. Near the tail end, I've given you a little backing track that you can use to practice the A natural minor scale on different strings. Just moving up and down the string, just as usual right now. If you already know how to play the A natural minor scale across strings, you can do that if you want, but you're probably very used to that and not going laterally along the string. So I would encourage you to do that as well. So there you go. That's the dark side of the C major scale, so to speak. Introducing you to the world of the minor scales. The minor scales come from the major scale. Couldn't be more simple. Where? The 6th degree of the major scale. What's in common between the two? Every note in the major scale exists in the relative minor scale. Every chord in the major scale exists in the relative minor scale. It produces a new order in the relative minor scale, but don't treat that as trivial. The order completely transforms the sound environment, which transforms into an emotion that's completely different from the major scale. So commonly, the major scale is interpreted as a happy, pleasant sound, and the minor scale is interpreted as a sad sound. And so it should. We need sounds that reflect how we feel. And we sometimes feel happy, and we sometimes feel sad, and we have weird mixtures of the two where it's bittersweet. Composers can produce bittersweet music if they need a bittersweet sound for a bittersweet visual moment in a movie. Okay, on that note, dig into issue number 9, the dark side. Spend a bit of time with the A natural minor scale. Big ideas are to get the interval formula underway, get that into your mind. Spend some time playing the scale up and down any string you choose, but I have a few examples set out in the PDF for you. And that's it. Now from there, just a little spoiler alert, I'm going to show you how knowing that natural minor scale is going to help you understand where one of the most popular scales you've probably played comes from in the next edition. I think it's the next edition. I've got usually 2 or 3 of these going on at once. So stay tuned for that. We're continuing with the whole theme of how things are connected, how they're not fundamentally that difficult to understand, so that you feel more confident in understanding how it lays out here and understanding how the language of music works in the big picture. Until then, Steve Dempster, Dempster Guitar Studio. I'll talk to you soon. Cheers.